Story 1. It was the kind of night that Oakhaven, Maine, excelled at creating. The rain, a steady, rhythmic hush, drummed against the old clapboard of my rented cottage, a lullaby of water on wood. Inside, the only light came from the warm, yellow glow of the lamp beside my armchair, casting long, dancing shadows across the stacks of books and papers that seemed to have spontaneously sprouted since I moved here. The scent of damp earth and distant sea salt mingled with the comforting aroma of old paper and lukewarm tea. I had come to Oakhaven seeking quiet. After decades chasing headlines, reporting from places where the air thrummed with urgency and often despair, I craved the slow cadence of a life where the most exciting news was the arrival of the spring mackerel run. My days were now filled with long walks along the rocky coast, the disciplined solitude of writing my memoirs, or trying to, and increasingly the gentle, almost accidental, pursuit of forgotten histories. Oakhaven, with its stoic granite buildings and ancient elms, held a quiet promise of stories whispered by the tides, if one only knew how to listen. It started, as these things often do, with something entirely mundane. I was volunteering at the Oakhaven Historical Society, mostly organizing dusty archives, a task my methodical nature found surprisingly soothing. One crisp autumn afternoon, while sifting through a box of miscellaneous town records from the 1970s, old tax ledgers, defunct business licenses, forgotten meeting minutes, my fingers brushed against a slim, leather-bound diary tucked beneath a pile of brittle newspaper clippings. It was small, unassuming, its cover worn smooth by countless years of handling, or perhaps simply time. The pages within were filled with elegant, looping script, fading like old photographs. It belonged, I learned later, to a woman named Elara Vance. Her name wasn't immediately familiar, which was unusual. In a town as small as Oakhaven, families were like roots, intertwined and deeply embedded. The entries were mostly unremarkable: observations on the weather, details about her flower garden, notes on her daily chores, and snippets of local gossip. A quiet life, meticulously recorded. But then there was a sudden, jarring halt. The entries stopped abruptly on October 17, 1976. No explanation, no indication of illness or travel. Just a blank page, followed by more blank pages until the diary's end. My journalist's instinct, dulled by years of retirement, twitched. It was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, like a spider's web vibrating in a barely felt breeze. Why had she stopped? Was it simply that she'd moved on to another diary, or had life, in its infinite unpredictability, simply ceased for Elara Vance on that particular autumn day? I made some discreet inquiries. The Historical Society's resident expert, a spry woman named Martha, who had lived in Oakhaven her entire 86 years, frowned faintly when I mentioned the name. Elara Vance, she mused, her voice thin as dry leaves. Ah yes, the one who disappeared. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken weight. Disappeared? I prompted gently, careful not to push. Martha sighed, a sound like paper crumpling. Well, that's what they called it. After a while, anyway. She was new to Oakhaven then, just moved into that old house by the lighthouse. Quiet sort, kept to herself. One day, she just wasn't there. Her door was unlocked, her little dog was alone, barking. Nothing taken. They searched, of course. For weeks they searched. But no trace. Eventually, the police closed the case. Said she likely just left, started a new life somewhere. Or fell into the sea, perhaps, on a stormy night. Oakhaven can be unforgiving that way. She paused, her gaze drifting towards the rain-streaked window, as if seeing ghosts in the mist. But her garden, it was still full of blossoms. And the dog, little Pip, he waited by the door for months. Didn't seem right, somehow. Didn't seem right. That phrase echoed in my mind as I walked home through the damp, quiet streets, the foghorn's mournful call a distant companion. It was the kind of phrase that, to an investigative mind, spoke volumes. It wasn't an accusation, not a conspiracy theory, just a quiet sense of something unfinished, a loose thread in the tapestry of a town's memory. Back in my cottage, with the lamp glowing and the rain tapping out its steady rhythm, I began to delve deeper. I revisited the Historical Society, this time armed with purpose. I sought out newspaper archives, dusty microfiches that smelled faintly of vinegar, and the few remaining official records of that time. Elara Vance, the papers reported, was in her early 30s, a recent arrival from Boston. She had bought the small, charmingly dilapidated cottage near the old Oakhaven lighthouse, clearly seeking a quiet retreat. Her few neighbors described her as artistic, reserved, but always polite. She painted watercolors of the rugged coastline and spent hours tending her vibrant garden, a splash of color against the austere gray of the main landscape. The initial police reports were frustratingly brief. A missing person report, a perfunctory search, a conclusion that she was presumed to have left. No foul play suspected, no leads, just the silence of her empty cottage and the enduring mystery of her absence. But as I pieced together the fragments, little details began to surface, like smooth, gray stones unearthed from wet soil. The diary mentioned a correspondence with a distant cousin, a woman named Beatrice, who Alara relied on for advice and comfort. I found no records of Beatrice ever being contacted by authorities, or if she was, her input was not recorded. There was also a recurring mention of a local fisherman, a taciturn man named Silas, who often helped Alara with odd jobs around her property. He was one of the few people she seemed to interact with regularly, beyond a polite nod in the general store. The police interview with Silas was brief, his answers clipped and unhelpful, stating he hadn't seen her in days before her disappearance. Yet, one of Alara's last diary entries, made just days before she vanished, mentioned Silas fixing a stubborn latch on her garden gate. A small detail, but one that hinted at a more recent interaction than he had initially claimed. I found myself spending my evenings hunched over photocopies of old documents, the soft glow of my lamp illuminating the fading ink. The sound of the rain on the roof became a constant companion, a comforting backdrop to my quiet detective work. Sometimes a gust of wind would rattle the window panes, and I would pause, listening, as if the old house itself held secrets it wished to share. The lack of urgency in the initial investigation puzzled me. Was it simply that a new arrival, unrooted in the community, was deemed less worthy of sustained effort? Or was there something else? Oakhaven was a close-knit town, but like all small towns, it had its unspoken rules, its undercurrents. Outsiders were often viewed with a blend of polite curiosity and a subtle, almost imperceptible distance. Alara Vance, with her quiet artistic pursuits and solitary life, seemed to fit that mold perfectly. The more I read, the more I felt a quiet sympathy for Alara. Her diary, in its mundane details, painted a picture of a gentle soul seeking solace, just as I had. She wrote about the beauty of the sea, the challenge of coaxing life from her rocky garden, and a yearning for connection that seemed just beyond her grasp. The last entry, before the void, spoke of a feeling of unease, a sense of being watched, though she dismissed it as merely her imagination, a product of being alone in the old, creaking house. Silly nerves, she had written, her looping script slightly more hurried than usual. Just the wind in the eaves. I drove out to the old Vance cottage near the lighthouse one misty morning. It stood abandoned, a skeletal gray against the swirling mist, its windows like vacant eyes. The garden, once a riot of color, was now overgrown, a wild tangle of thorny bushes and resilient weeds. But even through the neglect, I could see the ghost of what it once was, the careful planning, the evident love. It struck me then, with a quiet certainty, that a woman who poured so much of herself into a garden, who took such meticulous care to document her days, would not simply abandon it all without a word. My research led me down quiet alleys of Oakhaven history. I discovered a forgotten family feud over land rights that dated back generations, a minor local scandal involving a crooked land deal in the very same area where Alara's cottage stood. Was it possible her property, unassuming as it seemed, held some hidden value, some piece of a larger puzzle? It felt like grasping at shadows, but the thought lingered. I also stumbled upon a series of local eccentricities. An old hermit who lived in the woods further inland, known for his reclusive nature and his almost preternatural ability to know things about the town he shouldn't. Locals called him Old Man Hemlock. He died a few years after Alara's disappearance, taking whatever knowledge he possessed with him into the mossy earth. Was he simply a local legend, or did he hold a piece of the puzzle that was now forever lost? One evening, as the rain turned to a soft drizzle, leaving the air cool and clean, I found myself rereading Alara's last diary entry. The silly nerves, the wind in the eaves. But what if it wasn't just the wind? What if her unease was justified? I reflected on how easily a person, particularly an outsider, could vanish in a place like Oakhaven in 1976. No cell phones, no widespread internet, limited surveillance. A small town, insular and self-contained, where secrets could be buried as easily as memories. The sea, vast and indifferent, could swallow a body without a trace. The dense, ancient forests inland could conceal anything. The truth, I realized, was probably far less dramatic than a grand conspiracy. Perhaps she did simply wander off and get lost in the unforgiving landscape. Perhaps a tragic accident occurred by the treacherous cliffs near her home. But the nagging feeling, the subtle discord in the official narrative remained. The quiet certainty that something, however small, had been overlooked or perhaps deliberately unremarked upon. I never found a definitive answer. Ilara Vance's fate remains one of Oakhaven's quiet mysteries. Her diary, now carefully preserved at the Historical Society, still ends abruptly on October 17, 1976, a silent testament to a life that simply ceased to be. I often sit by my window on nights like this, the rain a gentle patter, the lamp casting its soothing glow, and I think of Ilara. I wonder what her last thoughts were, what she saw or felt in those final moments. The story of Ilara Vance isn't about a solved crime or a triumphant revelation. It's about the quiet echoes that linger in a place, the forgotten whisper of a life, and the enduring human need to understand, even when understanding remains just out of reach. It's a reminder that some stories, no matter how diligently researched, never quite yield their full truth. They simply exist, suspended in the cool, timeless air, like the scent of an old book, a quiet mystery waiting for someone to listen. And sometimes, in the gentle hush of the rain, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the soft turning of those final, blank pages. Story 2. It was on one of those endlessly gray Oregon afternoons, the kind where the rain falls not in sheets, but in a persistent, almost meditative drizzle, that I first encountered the whisper of Ilara Vance. My small, creaking house, nestled on the edge of Havenwood, had long since embraced the damp embrace of the Pacific Northwest. Inside, the only sounds were the soft patter against the aged cedar shingles and the quiet turning of pages as I delved into the town's archived past. My profession, if you could call such a solitary pursuit a profession, was that of a historical cartographer, albeit one who dealt less with maps and more with the faded, brittle narratives of lives long gone. I spent my days sifting through old newspaper microfilms, brittle town council minutes, and the handwritten journals of long-dead homesteaders. My workspace, a cluttered sanctuary, smelled perpetually of aged paper, a faint hint of cedar from the walls, and the ever-present aroma of brewing Earl Grey tea. A single, amber-glow lamp cast a warm circle on my desk, pushing back the encroaching twilight. It was a cozy, almost somnolent existence, perfect for someone who sought stories that had been buried by time, not with malicious intent, but simply by the natural drift of forgetting. Havenwood itself was a sleepy hollow, a place whose boom-and-bust logging days were long behind it. Now it was a town of quiet, settled rhythms, where the main street boasted a single general store, a diner with perpetually fogged windows, and a library whose collection seemed to grow organically, like moss on an old tree. People here didn't rush. They nodded greetings, spoke in hushed tones, and seemed to move with the same unhurried pace as the river that wound through the valley. It was the perfect place for a story to sink without a ripple, to become part of the very soil. I had been researching the shift in land ownership patterns after the big timber mill closed in the 1970s, a rather dry topic, when a series of tiny, almost imperceptible notices began to appear in the Havenwood Sentinel. They were small, no more than an inch square, tucked away between advertisements for farm equipment and announcements of church bake sales. Missing person, Ilara Vance. Each successive notice was slightly smaller, less prominent, until they vanished entirely. There was no follow-up article, no front-page headline, no public outcry that I could discern from the muted, understated tone of the decades-old newsprint. It was as if Ilara Vance had simply unstitched herself from the fabric of the town. This quiet disappearance, so devoid of drama in the historical record, was precisely what piqued my curiosity. Most missing persons cases, even in small towns, leave at least a faint echo, a police report, a lost appeal, a local rumor. But Ilara Vance was a void. Her name, once printed in faint ink, now felt like a secret whispered only to the archive's dust motes. I pulled the microfiche drawer fully out, the metal grating faintly. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate feel of brittle paper, moved over the old census records. Ilara Vance, born 1948, lived alone in a small cottage on the very edge of town, where the asphalt road gave way to a gravel track leading into the sprawling Siskiyou National Forest. Her occupation was listed simply as artist. It seemed she had few immediate family members, no recorded spouse, no children. A solitary soul, perhaps, whose quiet life meant her absence wouldn't immediately register as a tremor in the community. My investigation began not with frantic phone calls or dramatic inquiries, but with the same gentle patience I afforded my historical maps. I started with the library, Havenwood's quiet heart. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, a woman whose spectacles were perpetually perched on the tip of her nose, had been there since before I was born. Her memory, while sometimes meandering, was a deep well of local lore. Ilara Vance, I murmured one afternoon, as the rain drummed a gentle rhythm on the library's large, arched windows. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paperbacks and the faint metallic tang of the radiators. Do you remember her? Mrs. Gable paused, her finger tracing a line on the spine of a book. Ilara, she repeated, her voice a soft hum. Oh yes, a quiet one Ilara was. Kept to herself. Lived up by the old logging trail, didn't she? Came in once a week, mostly for art books, things about plants. Always had a gentle way about her, like she was made of mist and moonlight. She didn't remember any great search, no panic gatherings. Just a slow dawning that Ilara hadn't been seen in a while. People just assumed she'd moved on, Mrs. Gable said, adjusting her spectacles. Artists do that, sometimes, don't they? Chase inspiration elsewhere. There was a wistfulness in her tone, a tacit acknowledgement that even in Havenwood, some lives simply slipped through the cracks. I spent weeks piecing together fragments. I visited the old general store. Mr. Henderson, the current owner, a man whose family had run the place for generations, remembered her only vaguely. Bought her flour and sugar, mostly, and good quality paper, the kind artists use. She didn't talk much, always paid in cash. He recalled the day the sheriff's deputy had come by, quietly asking if anyone had seen her. But that was it. No fuss. He shrugged, polishing the counter with a practiced motion. The silence spoke volumes. Ilara Vance had not been someone whose sudden absence caused alarm. The cottage itself was the next logical step. It lay a few miles outside town, nestled in a small clearing where the towering Douglas firs began their dense march up the mountainside. The gravel track was overgrown, little more than 2 faint ruts swallowed by moss and ferns. The rain had softened the earth, and my boots sank slightly with each step, the squelch a counterpoint to the distant caw of a crow. When I finally reached the cottage, it was clear no one had lived there for decades. The paint had long since peeled from the clapboard, revealing the gray, weathered wood beneath. The windows were either broken or boarded up, like blind eyes. A lone, gnarled apple tree in the overgrown yard still bore a few shriveled fruits, remnants of a forgotten spring. The silence here was profound, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves and the sighing of the wind through the tall trees. It felt less like an abandoned house, and more like a gentle resting place. I circled the perimeter, my gaze lingering on details. A small, handcrafted ceramic bird bath lay overturned near the porch, its delicate form half buried by fallen leaves. A rusted garden trowel lay next to a patch of stubbornly persistent lavender. It spoke of a life lived, even if that life had ended in an unremarked disappearance. What bothered me was the utter lack of closure. The moved-on explanation felt too simple for a woman who seemed to live so intentionally, so rooted in her quiet artistic pursuits. Why would she leave her home, her few possessions, without a word, without a final purchase from the general store, without returning a single book to the library? I found myself revisiting the old newspaper archives, looking for any other anomalies from that time. Nothing overtly connected to Ilara Vance, but I noticed a slight uptick in reports of cougar sightings in the area around the time of her disappearance, and a few cryptic mentions of a peculiar fog that had settled over the valley for several days. These were details that, on their own, meant nothing, but in the context of Ilara's vanishing, they became unsettling threads in an unfinished tapestry. I started drawing a map, not of the landscape, but of Ilara's last known movements, as best as I could reconstruct them. Her weekly trip to the library, her bi-weekly visit to the general store. The dates converged on a cool, early autumn week. The last sighting mentioned in the newspaper snippet was a brief note from a delivery driver who recalled seeing her walking down the gravel road, away from her cottage, toward the town, but couldn't recall the exact day. The most intriguing piece of information came from an unexpected source, an elderly man named Silas Thorne, who lived even further up the logging trail, a recluse known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the forest. He was a man who spoke in riddles and observed the world with the sharp, knowing eyes of a badger. I found him one afternoon splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing through the damp forest. He paused, wiping his brow with a gnarled hand, his gaze meeting mine. "You're the one poking round Alara Vance's place," he stated, not asked. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Yes," I admitted, surprised. "I'm trying to understand what happened." He gave a low chuckle, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the ancient trees. "Some things," he said, tapping his axe handle on a stump. "The forest keeps to itself." She was a kindred spirit to the woods, that Alara, more comfortable with the silence than with human chatter. Then he looked directly at me, his eyes piercing through the drizzle. "Last I saw her," he continued, his voice dropping, "was the morning the mist rolled in something fierce, thick as wool. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. She was walking into it, not out of it, carrying a small satchel, like she was going on a long walk. Didn't even look back. Into the mist?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper against the backdrop of the rain. He nodded slowly. "Aye, right into it." And the mist stayed for days, swallowing the valley whole. When it finally lifted, Alara was just gone. Silas didn't offer any theories, no dramatic pronouncements. He simply described what he saw, and the quiet implication of it was more profound than any wild speculation. Alara Vance, walking into a peculiar, enduring mist, carrying a satchel, never to be seen again. This conversation, combined with the lack of official concern and the subtle atmospheric details I'd unearthed, painted a picture not of foul play, but of something far more elusive. Was it a sudden decision to vanish, to truly embrace the solitude she seemed to crave, disappearing into the vast wilderness she loved? Or was it something else, something less tangible, perhaps even a gentle surrender to the very elements of Havenwood? The thick fog, the deep forest, the quiet rain, they all felt like accomplices in her disappearance, not through malice, but through their sheer, overwhelming presence. I never found any definitive answers. No body, no suicide note, no clue that pointed to a specific human intervention. Alara Vance's story remained an open chapter, its pages blank beyond a certain point. The files I compiled, neatly organized in a simple binder, held more questions than facts. Her cottage slowly collapsed into the earth, reclaimed by the relentless forest. Her name, once a faint whisper in old newsprint, became a quiet hum in my own thoughts, a recurring melody on rainy afternoons. Sometimes, as the rain patters against my roof, and the lamplight casts long shadows across my books, I imagine Alara Vance still walking. Not lost, but perhaps simply absorbed. Absorbed into the silence of the old-growth trees, into the endless gray mist, into the very earth of Havenwood itself. Her story is not a solved one, but rather a lingering presence, a gentle reminder that some mysteries are content to remain just that, beautifully, hauntingly unsolved, like a forgotten song carried on the wind through the deep woods. And in Havenwood, where time moves slowly and secrets are held close by the land itself, perhaps that's just how it was meant to be. And LT/immersive, I hope you found this story of Alara Vance both intriguing and soothing, like a quiet mystery unfolding in the dead of night. I aim to create a reflective atmosphere, focusing on the calm discovery of a long-forgotten event rather than any disturbing details. The story highlights how some truths remain elusive, even with diligent research, allowing the setting and the natural elements to become part of the enduring enigma. Story 3. The old house by the sea always had a story to tell, if you only knew how to listen. It wasn't a grand house, mind you, just a weathered cottage perched on a rise overlooking the restless Atlantic. My grandmother had lived there her whole life, and when it passed to me, I found myself drawn not just to the familiar creak of the floorboards or the scent of salt and old linen, but to the silence that hummed beneath it all. It was the kind of silence that suggested something had once been and then ceased. I was a researcher, a quiet sort, who preferred the company of forgotten documents to bustling crowds. After leaving the city, I decided to dedicate my time to the local history of Oakhaven, the sleepy coastal town where the cottage stood. It was a place where generations had lived and died, their tales mostly unwritten, save for the cryptic entries in old parish registers or the faded ink of newspaper archives. One particularly blustery autumn evening, with the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the roof and the wind sighing around the eaves, I was sifting through a box of my grandmother's belongings that I hadn't quite gotten around to sorting. Most of it was ephemera, old buttons, dried flowers, letters tied with brittle ribbon. But then, tucked beneath a stack of embroidered doilies, I found a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't my grandmother's hand inside. The script was delicate, looping, and the ink had faded to a sepia tone. The first few pages were ordinary, notes on tides, weather observations, simple recipes. But then, interspersed amongst the mundane, were entries that began to shift the quiet atmosphere of the room. They weren't explicit, not at all, but rather observations, questions, and a growing sense of unease. The journal belonged to a woman named Alara Vance, who, according to a handwritten inscription on the inside cover, had been the lighthouse keeper's wife in the early 1900s. Oakhaven's lighthouse stood sentinel on a craggy point, its beam a constant comfort to those at sea. It was a lonely life, being a keeper's wife, isolated by the elements and the vastness of the ocean. Alara's entries spoke of long stretches of solitude, the distant cry of gulls, and the rhythmic turning of the lamp. But as the pages turned, a subtle disquiet began to emerge. October 14, 1908, one entry read, "The storm raged for 3 days, and still, no sign of the sea serpent. Thomas worries for the crew. The villagers say she was ill-fated from the start. The sea serpent was a fishing trawler, lost at sea during a brutal storm. Local legend held that it was a cursed ship." But Alara's next entry, dated a week later, gave me pause. "Thomas returned from the cove this morning, his face like chalk. He spoke of lights, out where the sea serpent went down, flickering like restless spirits. He says it was no storm that took her." This was the first thread. Thomas, her husband, the lighthouse keeper, was a man of the sea, grounded in practicalities. For him to speak of restless spirits was uncharacteristic. I made a mental note to cross-reference this with local historical society records. Over the next few weeks, the journal became my constant companion. I'd sit by the window in the evenings, a cup of warm tea beside me, the dim yellow light of my reading lamp casting long shadows, and lose myself in Alara's observations. She wrote about the tight-knit community of Oakhaven, a village built on fishing and quiet resilience. But she also hinted at undercurrents, subtle tensions, and unspoken truths. November 3, 1908, read another entry. "Old Man Hemlock's boat, the Gale, found drifting near the rocks empty. His fishing nets were tangled, but the ropes were cut clean. They say he simply fell overboard in the night. But Hemlock was a fisherman from birth, steady as the tides, and his lamp was still lit." This was the second tremor in the quiet narrative. Cut clean. Not frayed by rocks, not broken by the sea. A deliberate act. The official report, which I later found in the town's dusty archives, simply listed Hemlock's death as accidental drowning. But Alara's journal suggested a deeper story. She didn't accuse, not directly, but her observations were sharp, her questions unvoiced but clear. The cottage itself seemed to breathe with these past whispers. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, or the waves crashed against the shore with a particular mournful sound, I felt as though Alara was there, her quiet concerns still lingering in the air. The smell of old paper and the faintest hint of ozone from the sea became inextricably linked with her story. I spent hours in the musty archives of the Oakhaven Historical Society. The librarian, a woman named Agnes with spectacles perched on her nose and a gentle, knowing smile, became accustomed to my frequent visits. She'd quietly point me towards forgotten ledger books, faded maps, and brittle newspaper clippings. Many of them corroborated the official versions of events: the sea serpent lost to a storm, Old Man Hemlock drowned. But Alara's journal provided a counter-narrative, a quiet descent. I found a few articles about the sea serpent incident. They spoke of the tragedy, the sorrow in the community. Then I found one, tucked away in a regional newspaper from a month after the incident, mentioning an unusual claim filed by a distant cousin of one of the lost crewmen, alleging suspicious circumstances surrounding the sinking. The claim was quickly dismissed. "Lack of evidence," the article stated, attributed to grief. But it was enough to spark my imagination. What had the cousin heard? What had made him suspect foul play? Alara's journal then started to focus on a particular family in Oakhaven, the Blackwoods. They were prosperous merchants, owning the general store and a small fleet of fishing boats. Alara's entries about them were subtle, veiled. The Blackwoods have purchased another parcel of land by the harbor. Their wealth grows, even as others struggle. Or, young Silas Blackwood carries himself with a new arrogance. He walks as if he owns the very air. These were not direct accusations, but they painted a picture of a family whose rising fortunes seemed to coincide with misfortunes befalling others. Old Man Hemlock had been known to speak his mind, to complain about the Blackwoods encroaching fishing territories. The sea serpent had also been a competitor, often bringing in larger hauls. It was all circumstantial, a tapestry woven from hints and quiet observations. Then came the entry that chilled me, despite the warmth of my lamp. February 12, 1909. Thomas is troubled. He saw something on the night the gale was lost. A light, not the lighthouse, but a smaller lamp, moving swiftly near the cliffs after the storm had passed. He believes he recognized the silhouette of a boat, one of the Blackwood vessels, though he will not speak its name aloud. He says the sea holds secrets, but men hold tighter to theirs. This was a direct implication, however hesitant. Thomas, a man who saw everything from his perch in the lighthouse, had witnessed something that contradicted the official narrative. But he was afraid. The power of the Blackwoods in a small town like Oakhaven would have been immense. To speak out against them could have meant ruin, or worse. The journal continued for a few more months, its entries becoming increasingly sparse, more hesitant. Elara wrote about the arrival of spring, the return of migratory birds, the quiet routines of lighthouse life. But the underlying current of unease never quite dissipated. Her final entry, dated July 1, 1909, was hauntingly simple. The quiet has returned, but some silences are louder than others. After that, the journal ended abruptly. There was no explanation, no final summation. Just silence. I tried to find records of Elara and Thomas Vance after that date. Thomas retired from lighthouse service a year later, moving inland to live with relatives. Elara's death certificate simply stated natural causes in 1912. No grand revelations, no official inquiries. Just the quiet closing of a chapter. I visited the lighthouse, now automated, its lamp still sweeping the horizon. I walked the rocky paths Thomas would have traversed, imagining his gaze fixed on the tumultuous waves, then on the furtive light near the cliffs. I stood where Old Man Hemlock's boat would have drifted, looking out at the expanse of the ocean. Oakhaven hadn't changed much in a century. The Blackwood family still owned the general store, though it was now run by a younger generation, polite and oblivious to the shadowed history I was uncovering. The sea still provided, and the rhythms of life continued. And yet, the feeling persisted, the unsolved nature of it all. Had the sea serpent truly been a victim of the storm alone? Had Old Man Hemlock simply fallen overboard? Or had there been something more deliberate, more sinister, orchestrated by those who sought to gain, and then shrouded in the quiet complacency of a small town? I never found definitive proof, no smoking gun, no confession. Elara Vance's journal remained a collection of observations, questions, and veiled truths. But it was enough. It was enough to know that the calm surface of Oakhaven had once been rippled by something dark, something that the sea eventually swallowed, but never quite forgot. Sometimes, late at night, when the house settles and the only sound is the distant thrum of the ocean, I think of Elara. I imagine her sitting by her own lamp, chronicling the subtle shifts in her world, witnessing shadows that no one else dared to name. Her story isn't one of grand heroism or dramatic revelation. It's a testament to the power of quiet observation, to the unsettling truth that some mysteries simply fade into the fabric of time, leaving behind only whispers and the faint scent of old paper. And in those moments, the silence of the old house doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels like a holding place, guarding secrets that the lighthouse beam, for all its vigilance, could never fully illuminate. Story 4. Oakhaven isn't on many maps anymore, not the vibrant, bustling kind anyway. It's the sort of town you stumble upon by accident, a place that time seems to have forgotten, preferring instead to linger in the golden hues of late afternoon sun, perpetually on the cusp of twilight. I had chosen it precisely for that reason. As a writer, I sought the kind of profound quiet that allows thoughts to unfurl like ferns in a damp forest, unhurried and undisturbed. My rented cottage, a charmingly aged structure with a porch that groaned under the weight of history, smelled faintly of old wood and the earth after a fresh rain. It was, in essence, a haven for introspection. I recall the first few weeks there, spent mostly in a comfortable armchair by the window, a cup of steaming Earl Grey always close at hand. The days blurred into a rhythm of gentle rain, the scratch of my pen across paper, and the comforting crackle of logs in the small fireplace. The air inside the cottage was often thick with the scent of pine and the subtle musk of old paper from the books I'd brought along. It was during one of these tranquil afternoons, as the light outside softened into a hazy gold, that my gaze fell upon a small, unassuming pamphlet tucked away on a dusty shelf. It was titled A Brief History of Oakhaven, and its cover, faded to a sepia tone, depicted a simpler time. My curiosity, a quiet and persistent companion, was piqued. The pamphlet spoke of the town's founding, its lumber mills, and a brief, prosperous boom, followed by a slow, gentle decline into the peaceful obscurity I now inhabited. There was a section, brief and almost cursory, that mentioned a period of unforeseen shadows in the mid-20th century, quickly glossed over with a vague reference to local difficulties. It was this phrase, so deliberately understated, that snagged my attention. A story, I sensed, lay buried beneath that polite brevity. The next day, the rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, transforming the unpaved lanes of Oakhaven into paths of dark, glistening earth. Armed with my umbrella and a notepad, I ventured out, drawn by an invisible thread to the town's small, brick-faced library. It wasn't a grand building, but rather a modest repository of local memory, presided over by Mrs. Gable, a woman whose eyes held the same knowing calm as the old oaks that dotted the town square. "Looking for anything in particular, dear?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur, like the rustle of dry leaves. "Just exploring," I replied, gesturing vaguely at the shelves heavy with bound periodicals and local histories. I was reading about Oakhaven's past, and I came across a mention of, well, unforeseen shadows from decades ago. Mrs. Gable offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, her gaze drifting towards the rain-streaked window. "Ah yes, Oakhaven has its stories, like any old place. Some are told, some are just felt." She then, without me asking, guided me to a small, secluded corner, where heavy, leather-bound volumes of the Oakhaven Chronicle lay waiting. The scent of old paper and ink was strong here, a comforting perfume of forgotten narratives. "You might find some of those shadows in here," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "though not always where you expect them." With a gentle nod, she left me to my quiet digging. I began with the years following the mid-century, working my way through the brittle, yellowed pages. Most of the news was what you'd expect from a small town: harvest festivals, school plays, local council meetings. Then, in the summer of 1957, a distinct shift. Not a headline, not a banner, but a series of small, increasingly urgent notices. "Missing, Elara Vance." Elara Vance. The name appeared repeatedly, a fragile butterfly pinned to the stern pages of history. She was 19, the daughter of the prominent Vance family, who owned the largest sawmill in the area. The initial articles were hopeful, reporting search parties and pleas for information. Then slowly the urgency faded. The notices became smaller, relegated to less prominent pages. Eventually they stopped altogether. The unforeseen shadows had a name. I spent the next several days immersed in the Chronicle, tracing Elara's disappearance. What struck me wasn't the dramatic details. There were few, but the profound silence that descended after her story vanished from the paper. It was as if the town had collectively decided to seal over the wound, to pretend it hadn't happened. There was no resolution, no body found, no culprit apprehended. Just an abrupt cessation of reporting, leaving a gaping void. My cottage became my sanctuary of inquiry. The soft light of my reading lamp often burned late into the night, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls as I pored over photocopied articles. The rain, a constant companion, drummed a soothing rhythm on the roof, a counterpoint to the quiet disquiet that had begun to settle in my mind. I started taking walks through the town, not with a journalist's aggressive pursuit, but with a researcher's quiet observation. I found the old Vance sawmill, now a skeletal ruin of rusted machinery and crumbling wood, swallowed by clinging vines. I imagined the bustling activity, Elara perhaps walking past it every day. I visited the small, well-kept cemetery, its headstones worn smooth by time, but Elara Vance was not there. No stone marked her passing, only her absence. I began to approach the older residents, not with direct questions about Elara, but with gentle inquiries about Oakhaven's past, its changes, its enduring spirit. Old Mr. Henderson, who ran the dusty general store, reminisced about the old days, his voice raspy like dry leaves. Things were different back then, he'd often say, his eyes distant, fixed on some unseen horizon. Folks kept to themselves more. Secrets stayed secrets. When I subtly steered the conversation toward the Vance family, a certain guardedness would fall over him, like a sudden fog. He'd nod, hum vaguely, and shift the topic to the price of flour or the unpredictable autumn weather. Mrs. Albright, who knitted intricate lace doilies in her sun-dappled living room, offered a similar quiet resistance. She remembered Elara, of course. A sweet girl, she'd sigh, full of life. It was a terrible thing, just terrible. But pressing for details felt like disturbing a sleeping memory, something she had consciously laid to rest. She spoke of the Vance family moving away shortly after, selling off their remaining properties. as if the very air of Oakhaven had become too heavy for them to breathe. What I gathered, piecemeal and through inference, was a picture of a close-knit community that, while outwardly supportive, also possessed a strong unspoken code of silence. In Oakhaven, certain events were acknowledged in hushed tones, then carefully placed back into the dark recesses of collective memory, not because of malice, but perhaps out of a deeply ingrained fear of stirring old sorrows, or perhaps old truths. One evening, as a particularly heavy rainstorm lashed against the cottage, making the old timbers creak and groan like a tired ship at sea, I found myself drawn to a small, locked wooden box I'd discovered in the attic of the cottage when I first arrived. The landlord had mentioned it once, vaguely, saying it probably belonged to a previous tenant and wasn't worth bothering with. But the subtle scent of lavender and aged paper emanating from it had always intrigued me. Today, armed with a makeshift lockpick fashioned from a paperclip, a rather dramatic gesture for my otherwise calm investigation, I managed to coax it open. Inside, nestled among dried rose petals and a yellowed silk ribbon, was a small, leather-bound diary. No name on the cover, no immediate clue as to its owner. Its pages, brittle and thin, were filled with a delicate cursive script, fading in places. The entries were dated from the mid-1950s, leading up to that fateful summer of 1957. I brewed myself a fresh pot of herbal tea, the steam curling warmly around my face, and settled in. The rain outside intensified, a symphony of drumming on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound that amplified the quiet intimacy of reading someone else's life. The diary, I soon discovered, belonged to a young woman named Clara, who lived just a few houses down from the Vance family. Her entries were mostly mundane, filled with observations about the weather, chores, and the occasional gossip. But as the months turned into weeks before Alara's disappearance, a new thread emerged. Clara often wrote about Alara, her vivacity, her dreams of leaving Oakhaven for the city, and a secret beau. Alara met him by the old fishing lodge again. One entry read, dated just weeks before the disappearance. He's from out of town, a traveling salesman. She says he promises the world, but I worry. Papa says those city types are all flash and no substance. Another entry spoke of Alara being so restless, so eager to be free of Oakhaven. Then a chilling entry dated the very day Alara vanished. Alara was so excited. She said she was finally going with him. She packed a small bag. I begged her not to. He seemed so urgent. She left just before dusk. The sky was the color of bruised plums. I have a bad feeling. The next entries were filled with Clara's growing anxiety, the increasing alarm in the town, and then the stark, profound silence. They say she just left, but I know she wouldn't have gone without a word to her family, not truly. Something isn't right. I heard her parents arguing about money, about a debt owed to someone powerful. The diary ended abruptly a few weeks after Alara's disappearance, with Clara expressing a fear for her own safety, a sense of being watched. I must be careful, the last entry read, the ink smudged as if written in haste. Some things are best left unsaid, for your own protection in this town. The silence that followed my reading was profound, broken only by the incessant drumming of the rain. The diary didn't provide a clear answer, no dramatic confession or definitive evidence. But it painted a different picture than the one in the Oakhaven Chronicle. It hinted at Alara not merely vanishing, but perhaps escaping or being silenced. It introduced a new element, the secret lover, the powerful, unnamed someone, and the fear that had gripped Clara. I felt a profound sense of melancholy, a quiet sorrow for Alara and for Clara. The diary's intimate voice had brought a human element to the dusty pages of the newspaper, transforming Alara from a historical footnote into a vibrant young woman with dreams and fears. It also deepened the mystery, adding layers of potential motives and hidden agendas that the official reports had entirely bypassed. The true nature of what happened to Alara Vance remained veiled. Did she run away with the salesman, only to disappear into the vast anonymity of the city, too proud or too scared to ever look back? Or did the powerful figure Clara hinted at play a more sinister role, silencing not just Alara, but the very memory of her? Oakhaven had long ago made its peace with the ambiguity, weaving the story of Alara's disappearance into its very fabric, a quiet current beneath the surface. It was a whisper, a question mark, a testament to the way some stories, instead of being solved, simply become part of the land itself. As my time in Oakhaven drew to a close, I returned the diary to its box, placing it back in the attic for another generation, another curious soul, to perhaps stumble upon. The sun, finally breaking through the clouds on my last morning, cast a soft, forgiving light over the old town. The air smelled crisp and clean, washed by the weeks of rain. I left Oakhaven with no grand answers, no detective's triumph, but with a quiet understanding of the intricate tapestry of human experience, of the stories that linger, half told, in the shadows of forgotten places. And sometimes, the most profound truths are found not in what is revealed, but in the enduring mystery of what remains unspoken. The whisper of Oakhaven and Alara Vance became a part of me, a soothing, contemplative echo in the quiet chambers of my mind. Story 5. It's late, and the world outside my window is a study in muted grays and soft, rhythmic sounds. Rain, a steady, patient curtain, descends upon the old Victorian house I've rented for the season, tapping a lullaby against the leaded panes. The only other light in the room comes from the amber glow of a single desk lamp, casting long, wavering shadows that dance with the breeze from the slightly open window. There's a faint scent of old paper and damp earth lingering in the air, a familiar comfort to a historical researcher like myself. This particular scent always accompanies the quiet unfolding of forgotten lives. I'm in Oakhaven, a village so tucked away on the Oregon coast that it feels less like a place on a map, and more like a secret whispered between the ancient firs and the murmuring ocean. I came here seeking echoes, the kind of subtle vibrations left by stories that slipped through the cracks of official records and faded from common memory. And Oakhaven, with its perpetually misty mornings and houses that lean into the wind like old sailors, held just such a whisper. My initial interest was purely academic, tracing the migratory patterns of early 20th century loggers and fishermen along this rugged stretch of coastline. But as often happens when one delves into the dust and quietude of history, a different thread, shimmering with a peculiar unsolved luminescence, caught my eye. It began, as these things often do, in the archives of the small, charmingly cluttered Oakhaven Public Library. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose spectacles seemed perpetually perched on the brink of escape, and whose memory was as vast and intricate as the town's own history, was my unwitting guide. One rainy afternoon, much like this one, I was sifting through bound volumes of the Oakhaven Oracle, the local newspaper from the 1930s. The pages were brittle, crinkling like autumn leaves beneath my careful touch, the ink a faded testament to hurried deadlines and long-forgotten daily dramas. Most entries were mundane, bake sale announcements, fishing quotas, obituaries. But then, tucked amidst the notices of canning competitions and church suppers, I found a series of articles, brief and almost apologetic in their tone, about the Fairweather incident. The name itself held a certain poetic melancholy. Fairweather. It was the family name of a young couple, Elias and Clara, and their infant daughter Lily. They lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Oakhaven, nestled close to the dense forest that hugged the coast. The articles, spanning a few weeks in the summer of 1937, reported their sudden, inexplicable disappearance. Not a trace. Just gone. Ah, the Fairweathers, Mrs. Gable had murmured when I inquired, her voice soft as the rustle of turning pages. She'd been dusting a shelf of maritime histories, her movements slow and deliberate. That was a sorrowful business. Never did get to the bottom of it, did they? Her tone wasn't one of excitement or ghoulish curiosity, but rather a quiet, almost mournful resignation. It was the tone of someone remembering a persistent ache, rather than a sharp wound. This gentle, lingering mystery, so unlike the sensational headlines of most true crime, was precisely what drew me in. It wasn't about violence, but about absence, about a void where lives had once been. I began to gather the fragments. The first article, dated July 15, 1937, was a small notice on page 3. Local family not seen. It stated simply that neighbors had reported the Fairweathers' cottage quiet for several days, the curtains drawn, no sign of life. A subsequent article mentioned a brief search by local authorities, hampered by the dense woods and the unpredictable coastal fog. There was talk of a possible departure, a sudden decision to leave Oakhaven, though no one recalled seeing them pack or board a train or ship. No forwarding address, no goodbyes. Just an empty house. The final mentions faded into the background of news about rising tensions in Europe and the persistent economic woes of the Depression. The Fairweather incident was quietly subsumed by the larger anxieties of the world, a local riddle destined to be forgotten by all but a handful of residents. My own investigation unfolded with the same slow, deliberate pace as the Oakhaven tides. It wasn't about solving a crime in the conventional sense. It was about understanding the contours of a loss that was never truly accounted for. I visited the Fairweather cottage. It still stood, though now owned by an elderly woman who had inherited it from a distant relative who bought it years after the incident. It was well maintained, but I could feel the echoes within its walls. The current owner, a kind woman named Agnes, knew nothing of the history beyond a vague mention of some old family who moved away suddenly. The village, it seemed, had collectively agreed to forget, or perhaps, simply to not speak of, the unexplained. I spent hours poring over old land deeds, census records, and community logs. Elias Fairweather had been a quiet carpenter, new to Oakhaven, drawn by the promise of work. Clara was a seamstress, known for her intricate needlework. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable people leading unremarkable lives. This ordinariness, paradoxically, made their vanishing all the more profound. How does a family simply cease to exist without a ripple? One afternoon, seeking refuge from a particularly blustery day, I found myself in the Oakhaven Historical Society, housed in the town's original schoolhouse. It was a dusty, charming place, filled with forgotten tools, sepia-toned photographs, and shelves groaning under the weight of local histories. Mr. Henderson, the Society's sole volunteer, a man whose voice was perpetually hoarse from years of bellowing over the roar of the ocean, proved to be another gentle source. He didn't immediately volunteer information about the Fairweathers. Like Mrs. Gable, he seemed to hold the story close, a delicate glass ornament he was reluctant to handle too roughly. But as I expressed my interest in Oakhaven's lesser-known historical narratives, he eventually steered me towards a thick, leather-bound ledger. "Some folks," he rasped, his eyes twinkling behind thick lenses, "they just drift away, like a fog bank. You see it, then you don't. That's what happened with them, I reckon." The ledger was a record of community donations and significant events, kept by the town's earliest schoolmistress. Tucked between entries about the planting of a new maple tree and the annual fishing derby, there was a single meticulously penned note, dated nearly a year after the Fairweathers vanished. July 3, 1938. Received donation from the Fairweather estate, proceeds from the sale of their cottage. Unclaimed. Proceeds to fund new school books. A sorrowful end to a hopeful beginning. Unclaimed. The word resonated with a chilling finality. It wasn't just that they were gone. It was that no one had ever come looking. No family had stepped forward to claim their meager belongings or the proceeds from their sold home. It suggested a profound isolation, or perhaps a deliberate severing of ties. The most intriguing piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Old Captain Silas, a retired fisherman who spent his days whittling intricate wooden birds on the pier. His face was a roadmap of sun and wind, his eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was known for his long silences, broken only by the occasional gruff observation. I approached him one afternoon, offering him a thermos of hot tea. We sat on a weathered bench, the gulls crying overhead, the scent of salt and drying nets thick in the air. I casually brought up the Fairweathers. He stopped whittling, his knife poised. "Fairweathers," he repeated, the name a stone in his mouth. "Quiet folk, kept to themselves." Then, after a long pause, during which I could hear the gentle slap of waves against the pilings, he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. "Saw him once, down by the old cove, just before they went." My heart gave a soft flutter, like a trapped bird. "What did you see, Captain?" He looked out at the horizon, his gaze fixed on some unseen point. Moon was full. Night before the fog rolled in, thick as pea soup. Saw their lantern, down by the water. And something else. A light. Not a ship's light. Too high. Like a star, almost. Moving. Slow. Then it was gone. And so were they." He returned to his whittling, the rhythmic scrape of the knife against wood the only sound between us. He offered no further elaboration, no theories, no dramatic pronouncements. Just that quiet, peculiar observation. A moving light, high in the sky, gone with the family. It was the kind of detail that could be dismissed as an old man's fading memory, a trick of the light, or a simple misidentification. But in the quiet, reflective atmosphere of Oakhaven, it felt like a crucial, unsettling grace note in a symphony of the unexplained. I also discovered that the Fairweathers had purchased their cottage from an eccentric old woman named Alara Vance, who was rumored to have had a fascination with ancient coastal folklore and celestial phenomena. Her journals, which I found in a sealed box in the Historical Society, were filled with cryptic observations about the tides, the moon, and strange wanderers in the night sky. She wrote of thinning veils and doors opening and closing between worlds. It was fanciful, perhaps, but it added another layer of quiet, unsettling possibility to the Fairweather story. Did she believe something truly unusual was possible? And did the Fairweathers, perhaps, inherit more than just a cottage from her? As the days turned into weeks, my initial academic pursuit morphed into a gentle obsession with the Fairweather incident. I wasn't looking for a culprit or a definitive answer. Rather, I was tracing the faint ripples left by their absence, listening to the silence they had left behind. The true crime wasn't a violent act, but the profound mystery of a life simply ceasing to be, leaving no explanation, no closure. I'd often sit by the window in the evening, the lamps glow warm against the cool night, sipping tea as the rain continued its gentle patter. I would imagine Elias and Clara, a young couple with a new baby, building a life in this quiet corner of the world. What were their dreams? What hopes did they carry into that last night? Did they look up at the full moon, just as Captain Silas had described, and see something that called to them, or something that simply, irrevocably took them away? The beauty of the Oakhaven mystery is its persistent refusal to yield a neat solution. There were no bloodstains, no ransom notes, no confessions. Just the empty cottage, the unclaimed estate, and the captain's hushed tale of a moving light. It was a vanishing that defied logic, a quiet erasure that seemed to suggest not a violent confrontation, but a seamless transition out of existence. Perhaps they simply packed their bags in the dead of night, seeking a new life away from the economic hardships of the time, and purposefully cut all ties. It's the most rational explanation, yet it doesn't quite fit the meticulous nature of the town records or the stunned reactions of their neighbors. People don't just disappear without a single ripple. Or do they? And the light? Was it a passing aircraft, rare but not impossible in 1937? A trick of the moonlight on the mist? Or something else entirely, something that Oakhaven, in its timeless solitude, had quietly witnessed and then, just as quietly, absorbed back into its fabric of secrets? I never did find a definitive answer. The records end abruptly. The town elders, those who even remember, offer only hushed tones and resigned shrugs. The Fairweather cottage stands, solid and unremarkable, just another house by the sea. And that, perhaps, is the most profound part of this story. It's not a tale of detection and dramatic reveal, but a meditation on the unknown. It's a reminder that sometimes, the most intriguing true stories are not those with a clear beginning, middle, and end, but those that linger unresolved like a persistent question mark etched into the landscape. As the rain softens to a mere drizzle, and the first hint of dawn begins to paint the eastern sky with pale grays, I close my notebook. The words I've written feel less like a report, and more like a quiet conversation with the past, a lullaby woven from whispers and shadows. The Fairweathers remain a mystery, a gentle enigma held close by the mists of Oakhaven. And perhaps that is precisely how their story was always meant to be told. Not solved, but remembered in the quiet hours when the world outside is hushed and the imagination is free to wander. Story 6. It was on one of those evenings when the fog rolled in from the Atlantic like a shy, gray ghost that I first truly felt the history of Gull's Point. My small cottage, a sturdy old thing with a perpetually damp scent of salt and ancient wood, faced the harbor. The lamp on my desk cast a warm, dim circle, illuminating the yellowed pages of the town's archived newspapers. Outside, the steady rhythm of rain on the roof had lulled the world into a hushed stillness, broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn. I had moved to Gull's Point a few years prior, a retired history teacher with a quiet ambition to pen a comprehensive chronicle of this sleepy coastal town. My days were spent sifting through dusty ledgers in the town hall, poring over brittle photographs in the Historical Society, and occasionally coaxing fragmented memories from the town's oldest residents, their voices raspy like dry leaves. Most of the stories I unearthed were simple, charming tales of hardy fishermen, resourceful women, and the slow, inevitable march of time. But every now and then a thread would appear, pulled from the fabric of the past, that felt a little different. It began with a passing mention in a faded obituary from 1952. Eleanor Vance, aged 23. Lost at sea. It was a common enough fate in a fishing village. Yet, the brief notice seemed to carry an unspoken weight, a hesitation in its very brevity. It wasn't the kind of detailed lament often afforded to those taken by the ocean's unforgiving embrace. It was almost dismissive. My curiosity, a gentle, persistent hum, began to stir. The name, Eleanor Vance, wasn't one I had encountered in the usual town narratives. She wasn't part of the founding families, nor did she feature in the town's social registries from the mid-century. It was as if she had drifted into Gull's Point on one of those fogs and then simply, silently vanished. I decided to pull the microfiche for the local gazette, the Gull's Point Chronicle, for the weeks surrounding her death. The whirring of the old machine was a comforting drone in the quiet library annex. Page after page of local news scrolled by. Church suppers, school honor rolls, the price of lobsters, the usual rhythm of small-town life. Then a small article buried deep within a late October edition caught my eye. Local woman vanishes. Not lost at sea. This was an important distinction. The article stated that Eleanor Vance, a newcomer to Gull's Point, had been reported missing by her landlady, Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle, after failing to return from an evening stroll along the old lighthouse trail. No immediate foul play was suspected, the paper noted, given the treacherous cliffs and unpredictable weather. A search had been organized, involving the local constabulary and a few volunteers. But the search, it seemed, had yielded nothing. The follow-up article, a week later, simply stated that the search had been called off due to inclement weather and dwindling hope. And then silence, until that brief obituary months later, changing vanishes to lost at sea. Why the change? And why so little fuss? My history teacher's mind, accustomed to dissecting discrepancies, was gently nudged awake. I felt a quiet pull, an invitation to piece together a story that time had almost erased. My first stop was Mrs. Periwinkle's old address. The house was still there, a charming, albeit slightly slumped, two-story affair with a picket fence. An elderly woman named Martha lived there now, her hair the color of dandelion fluff. She had bought the house from Agnes's children decades ago. Martha remembered Agnes, of course. A good woman, she'd said, stirring her tea, but kept to herself after that whole business. That whole business? I probed gently, taking a sip of my own lukewarm tea. The smell of sun-warmed dust motes danced in the afternoon light, filtering through the lace curtains. Martha sighed, a soft, wistful sound. Eleanor Vance. Pretty girl. Not from around here, you know. Came from the city, they said. For the sea air, or some such. Agnes liked her, though she was quiet. Kept to herself, too, mostly. Martha's eyes, the color of faded denim, stared out the window, as if seeing something beyond the manicured lawn. They said she just walked off. Into the fog. That's what Constable Peterson told everyone. But Agnes, she had her doubts, I think. Never said much, but she always looked troubled. What kind of doubts? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Martha hesitated, then shrugged. Just a feeling, I suppose. Agnes said Eleanor always walked the path on clear days. Never in the fog. Said she was particular about that. And Eleanor's little silver locket, the one she always wore, was found on her dresser. Agnes said she never took that locket off, not even to sleep. A silver locket. A small, intimate detail. It was like finding a single, perfectly preserved seashell on a vast, empty beach. It suggested a sudden, unexpected departure, not a planned stroll. My next step led me to the dusty annals of the local constabulary. The current chief, a young man named Chief Miller, was helpful, if a bit bewildered by my interest in a 70-year-old cold case. He found the original police report from 1952. It was sparse. Eleanor Vance missing. Last seen wearing a pale blue dress and a knitted shawl. No signs of struggle. No forced entry into her room. The trail at the lighthouse was searched. Local fishermen dragged parts of the harbor. Nothing. The report concluded, almost dismissively, presumed drowned. No further action. But there was an addendum, scrawled in faded ink at the bottom, dated weeks later. It was a note from Constable Peterson. Received anonymous tip regarding Mr. Silas Croft. Investigated. No evidence found. Case closed. Silas Croft. The name pricked at my memory. He was a local shipwright, known for his gruff demeanor and meticulous craftsmanship. He had died in the late 1980s, a recluse to the end. I remembered seeing his name in a few other Old Town documents, usually related to property disputes or minor infractions. Nothing to suggest anything sinister. I decided to visit the old Croft shipyard, now a collection of crumbling sheds and rusted equipment, slowly being reclaimed by the salt and weeds. The air hung heavy with the ghost of sawdust and tar. The sound of waves lapping gently against the abandoned dock pilings was the only sound. It was here, in a collapsed lean-to, that I found it, a small, weathered journal, tucked under a pile of discarded ropes and netting. It was Silas Croft's. His handwriting was a tight, angular script, detailing daily tasks, weather observations, and meticulous accounts of timber and nails. But scattered throughout were short, cryptic entries that began around the time of Eleanor's disappearance. October 28th. Fog thick. Heard commotion by Lighthouse Trail. Saw nothing. November 3rd. Peterson came. Asked questions. Said nothing. November 10th. Whispers. They think, but they can't prove. She was difficult. December 1st. The sea keeps secrets. Some better left untouched. She was difficult. The phrase hung in the quiet air of the decaying shed. What did he mean? Was it a justification? A veiled admission? Or simply the observation of a man who held a secret? I closed the journal, the old leather feeling surprisingly supple in my hands. The rain had softened to a fine mist, clinging to the skeletal remains of the old ship frames. I thought of Eleanor, a young woman from the city, arriving in this remote, insular community, perhaps an outsider who didn't quite fit the mold. And Silas Croft, a solitary figure, whose life was as rough-hewn as the timber he worked. The official story of Eleanor Vance was that she was lost to the unforgiving sea. A simple, tragic tale, but the threads I had pulled suggested something more. A locket left behind, a landlady's quiet doubts, a constable's hasty conclusion, and the cryptic, unsettling entries in a reclusive shipwright's journal. I returned to my cottage as dusk deepened, the streetlights glowing with a hazy warmth through the lingering mist. The fire in my hearth crackled softly, a comforting counterpoint to the persistent tick-tock of the old grandfather clock in the hall. As I sat there, sipping hot tea, the case of Eleanor Vance felt less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a melody to be listened to. There were notes missing, dissonances unresolved, but the overall composition lingered. Was Silas Croft involved? Did he see something he shouldn't have? Did he know more than he let on? Or was he simply a lonely man, caught in the undertow of a small town's quick judgments? Gull's Point had, over the decades, gently folded Eleanor Vance's story into its collective amnesia, subsuming it under the broad, unquestioning label of Lost at Sea. Yet the subtle details, the locket, Agnes's troubled gaze, Silas's cryptic words, these small, persistent whispers still lingered, carried on the salt-laden breeze. The truth, in its entirety, remained just out of reach, like the horizon on a foggy day. And perhaps, I mused, as the rain began to patter more softly on the roof, that's just how some stories are meant to be. Not to be definitively closed, but to remain, in their quiet way, forever intriguing, forever a soft, unsolved mystery, a gentle whisper from the past that reminds us of the lives that once filled these quiet corners of the world. And sometimes, those whispers are the most compelling stories of all.